So we're on the air, everybody. Hello and welcome. It's great to be gathering again on the screen and in your homes to study Torah together. I sent out yesterday a text. Today, well, it went out last night. It went out last night. It went out last night. It went out. Something going on. We're having a problem with echo. Brenda, is your
The TV is, I'm going to turn the TV off.
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Yes, much better. Right. I was getting feedback. Right.
Yes, we were. And we're broadcasting, so we don't want to get feedback.
Right.
Okay. So can you please all mute yourselves? Thank you. And we are ready to go. The title that I sent out was carefully chosen. It said selections, right, of commandments and so on. I don't remember the exact title, but the one word that was really important to me was to put the word selection. Now, selection is often a meaningless word that means, a mix, like you get a selection of cheese and fruit on a platter. But I chose the word selection very carefully. And the reason is because I selected things I wanted to talk about, and I didn't select the things I don't want to talk about, which is probably not entirely fair, but I have a direction that I want to take us in. And if we included everything, we wouldn't be able to focus on the things that I think will be worthwhile in a particular conversation, which is the foundations of tikkun olam, the foundations of social justice, making the world a better place. In this chapter, this Torah portion, Ki Tetzeh, which stretches over 3 or 4 chapters, it has a real medley of different kinds of commandments, a real mix, both from some that are just ritual, some that are ritual commandments that are not practical, and some they're ritual, they're not focusing on legal issues. Some are social, some are communal, some are individual. It's a real mix. But it also, within this mix, is my selection of some of the commandments that really bring to the forefront things that we feel good about. When we think about the Torah, the ones that I selected are the things that make us feel good, that this is our text. And I left out intentionally some of the other ones that would distract us. I'll tell you what they are. I'm not trying to hide them. I just don't want us to focus on them, because when something bothers us or offends us or makes us feel uncomfortable, we're more apt to focus on that rather than on the aspects that go down easy. I would like us to begin by reading from the selections that I selected. And I'm going to start with Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 1. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass. You shall do the same with his garment. And so too shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. If you see your fellow's ass or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. You must help him raise it. So I really liked this little section, because on the one hand, it's so what's the word? It belongs in the past. We just don't really have many opportunities in our urban life to fulfill this mitzvah of our fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, or even our fellow's ass or his. The only one thing that is still current is garments. I imagine that in rural communities, there is more opportunity for this. But the concept of returning lost animals and returning lost objects, let's take a moment instead of reading through all of the laws just to talk about this one and hear some responses. I see Brenda had a hand up, and then Peter, and then Benita. So, and then Ruth. So let's start with Brenda. Can you please unmute yourself?
I'm reminded of an experience my son had when he was in elementary school. He put his summer camp prize jacket on the bench to play. And this was still school hours, recess. And when he went back, he couldn't find his jacket when he went back to the bench. Well, I was very upset, and I went to the school, and someone said that they believed it was a particular child, and the teacher called him out. And I, believe it or not, in those days in our little suburb, they let me drive him back to his house, and he went upstairs. He brought back down the jacket. His sister had been removing the letters, the felt letters, and she was in the middle of this process, obviously. But anyway, he gave me the jacket. I drove him back to the school. So that stayed with me, and it was more to tell my child, be more careful. But underneath, I felt a lot of disappointment, mostly disappointment. Then later on in college, my son went to a bar and grill with all the youngsters for beer, and he had on I guess a nice jacket or sweater, I don't remember. But what I do remember is he left it on the bar stool, and it was never returned. And that's not the way we were brought up. So this is very relevant, because this does happen every day. You see it, people leave purses, they leave all kinds of items in restaurants, and most times they're returned, most times. In a taxi, I found two wallets.
Let's stop with one anecdote just to give the others a chance. Thank you so much for sharing. Next person was Peter, then Benita, then Ruth.
Am I on? Yeah, I guess so.
Yes, you are.
What it doesn't say is the second answer. When you give it back, what happens if you fed it? You have to be paid for it. What happens if the cow becomes pregnant? You have problems back and forth. So the Talmud really gets into the meat of the law. This is just, this whole section you've given us is Law School 1. So,
well, thank you, Peter, for bringing up the Talmudic component. It leads into something really interesting and very broad and rich, in that the idea of property ownership as well as responsibility to animals has many manifestations, such as if you, as you just said, you landed up bringing in a lost animal and you fed it, you paid for its food, and then a person comes along and claims it and of course deserves to get it back, but they owe you something. And in fact, it goes as far in the Talmud of if a person stole an animal. He didn't just bring home a stray, he actively stole somebody else's animal, and maybe the animal had some kind of marking on its ear or something so that it was identifiable. And at the end of the season, it wasn't just an animal, it was a sheep in the spring. And then at the end of the summer, the owner comes by, and this sheep is covered in a wonderful woolly coat, and the thief has fed the sheep and kept the sheep going and made sure that it was okay. And then when the owner comes, the thief has to return the sheep, and he has to pay a fine, but the owner has to pay him for what he spent to keep his animal alive, because they acknowledge the right of the thief as well. He stole it and he fed it. And there's a financial piece in it. So the attitude towards the thief is much more generous than it is in our society. So we'll see that there are a couple of instances of how that is different. So thanks, Peter. Now on to Benita.
It's interesting, in today's world, people do pick up stray animals, particularly cats and dogs, and take care of them. During the Hurricane Katrina, there was a whole to-do about animals that were abandoned and what had to happen to them. They were taken to shelters. Some of the animals were even taken out of the New Orleans area and brought to other communities where they would be taken care of, with the idea that ultimately they would be returned to their owners if you could identify them. So the concept is not entirely outside of our experience today either.
Right. I think that that's a wonderful example of taking care of animals and respecting the life of an animal. And it's still a little different in the sense that the text here also includes a monetary component. In other words, these animals were property that was of value to the survival, part of the person's business. In other words, to have an ox or a sheep, the ox for plowing, the sheep for, for whatever, for wool or whatever they were going to do with this sheep. So, whereas for pets, there is a humane kind of, an emotional connection. It's not that, unless of course it's a working dog, like a chaplaincy dog or a guide dog. But yes, the idea that there's compassion for animals as well as respect for property of another person is a very big piece in this. Thank you for bringing it up. Now your turn, Ruth.
I just wanted to say that if, in reading this verse, if you take away the animals, you could think of people that are walking on the street. They look like they don't know where they're going, and you ask to help them. Or somebody has fallen, you ask if they obviously will need help, or a child that looks lost. So the lesson is for almost anything. Where you see somebody who needs some help, you're there to respond to them.
It's very well said. And there's a part that's critical to that whole statement, and that is, you must not remain indifferent.
Right.
That is a very key piece, and that underlies all of it, whether it is a human at risk or an animal or even a garment. The first example that Brenda gave of how when you lose a piece of property, the feeling of being of loss is real, as well as the feeling of betrayal by society, that people did what they did and didn't have a conscience. And so it's complicated, and the idea of not remaining indifferent to those feelings is very important. So let's go forward. There's so much more to talk about. I'm looking now at the second paragraph, verse 6, which is so rich and laden with concepts. If along the road you chance upon a bird's nest, in any tree or on the ground, with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let the mother go and take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. So this commandment is known as Shiluach Haken, the sending off from the nest. And it has many interesting ways of looking at it. So I'm opening it up again for any comments on this verse. Why do you think, for example, it's important to let the mother bird go away, and you can take the young but not the mother? Francis, unmute, please. Can you? I want to unmute you. I can't unmute you, but can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
The mother can reproduce again. And if the mother can reproduce again, you'll still get more eggs and more fledglings. And if you can keep eating, you'll live a long life.
And if you keep eating, that's interesting. So the idea that the mother can reproduce more is one piece of it. Another piece of it is that the fledglings cannot fend for themselves. So if you took the mother away, they would certainly die, and then you would be killing off 2 generations. Whereas if you let the mother live, then, as Francis said, she could A, take care of herself, and B, reproduce. Janet, I see your hands up.
Well, also, Tsar Balei Chaim, it would hurt the mother to see that her fledglings are taken. And then there's a story, a sad story, and you probably know it, and everyone else knows it, where a father sends up his son to remove the eggs, or the mother of the, and because you're supposed to have a long life if you do this mitzvah of sending away the mother, and the child falls and dies. And there was a rabbi, I think his name was Avuya.
Elisha ben Abuya. Good
Yeah.
for you, Janet.
And he actually lost his belief in God, because he said, how could you do such a thing if you say that sending away the mother is compassionate? And this child did just that, and then he falls and dies. And that, well, you can go on, because
That's beautiful. That's exactly what this story, I think, is best. This mitzvah is best known for that story that goes with it, where this great scholar, Elisha ben Abuya, witnesses this event that Janet described, where a father instructs his son to climb up a ladder, take the eggs, but let the mother fly away. So there's the mitzvah of the son obeying his father. And if you think about the mitzvot in the Torah, there are very few mitzvot that actually promise you a specific reward. But the mitzvah of honoring your parents promises you that your days will be long upon the good earth that the Lord your God has given you. So here this kid honors his father's wishes. He climbs up the ladder, does what his father tells him. And the other mitzvah is the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken, letting the mother bird fly away. He fulfills that mitzvah. And we also see that it says, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. So it's a double whammy. Doing one part of it, listening to the father, should have brought him a long life. The other part of it, letting the mother bird fly away, also should have brought him a long life. And what happens? He falls coming down on the ladder and is killed. And Elisha ben Abuya, who witnessed this, lost his faith. And he is known in the Talmud as Acher, the other. Because what do you do with someone who's actually a great scholar, who has so much to say, and who had such important rulings in the Torah? He was a great scholar, and yet he had a break of faith based on seeing so graphically before his eyes that you keep a commandment that has a promise that God says, and it doesn't work. And it's such a powerful story, because so many of us struggle with the events in our lives or in lives of other people, and we think, how is this possible? How can you hold on to faith when you have witnessed such terrible things? And it opens up a very contemporary question without a good answer. So that's why when I read this, I said, this is a very loaded question, a loaded verse. It has so many ramifications. So thank you both for your comments. Francis, you want to add one, and then I'm going to go to Betty.
Oh, is it me?
Yes.
Yeah, so it also shows that, you can spend your life doing the right thing, but good things don't always happen. Something can happen to screw it up. And so that you have to have faith in yourself also.
It's a very complex question of faith, indeed. Yeah. Thank you for adding that. Okay, Betty, you're on now.
I've been sitting here staring at the text and trying to understand why we're having this conversation to begin with, because it does not appear to me anywhere that the fledglings or the mother are in danger. So why does this engender this kind of issue of, who's to be saved? And
because it's about food. People in those days, if you find a nest of eggs, or a bird and eggs or fledglings, this is food. And so in a time when people didn't have supermarkets full like we do, and lived in a rural environment, if you came upon a nest of eggs, this was a great find for you to bring home.
So these were common property.
Sorry?
So this was common property. Anybody could
property.
Thank you for
somebody else's chicken or a tame animal. It's a free bird out there. You come upon the nest. You can't take the whole thing. You can't, in that sense, you can't be greedy. It's understanding that human beings also need to eat. And especially, as we'll see as we go further along, these texts relate to people who live from hand to mouth in destitute poverty, many people. And you cannot be greedy. You can't just say, well, I really need it. I have many mouths to feed. I'm taking all the eggs and the mother. That'll give me more food. You have to think about the animal and the environment and not drain the environment of all resources. So I'm so glad you raised that question. Thank you, Betty.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now I'm going to, Peter, coming back to you.
Just a quick thought is the story that Janet told. Isn't that the theme in A Driven Leaf, the book?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great book. And if you haven't heard of it and you'd like to read a very interesting book about, it's not nonfiction, but it's based on the history of the Talmud, and it's called As a Driven Leaf, and it's by Milton, is that right? I can't remember who wrote it. But sorry?
Milton Steinberg?
Milton Steinberg. So it's a wonderful book to read that gives you a perspective on what life was like in the time of the Mishnah, the Talmud. So thanks for reminding me, Peter, about that. That's actually right. Absolutely. So let's go forward. Now we come to building codes. So when you build a new house, you shall make a parapet on your roof so that you do not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. So I'm sure that any of you who ever had a house that needed renovations, or even if you built your house from scratch, you knew what you wanted to do, and the city said, no, that's you can't do that because you need to have certain safety features built in, and it seems like they're being overprotective. But this is an example, especially in a culture where houses had flat roofs, and people often slept on the roof, or would take figs and other vegetables to dry in the sunshine on the roof. So the roofs were used. They're not like our New England tiled roofs. They were flat roofs in the Middle East. And one had to be proactive in making sure that that you are not responsible for someone accidentally falling off. Moving right along. Number 9, you shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed, else the crop from the seed you have sown and the yield of the vineyard may not be used. You shall not plow with an ox and an ass together. So any thoughts on those two verses? One of them, the second one, verse 10, sounds a little more understandable. The first one, less so. Carol and then Benita.
It just reminds me of, is it sharpness? About mixing linen and wool,
Yes,
that there's this peculiar, and to me it's peculiar, notion that mixing certain kinds of things or mixing two different kinds of things is a bad thing, even though there's no apparent reason why that would be true.
Exactly. So I actually removed the sharpness one out by mistake. And the three go together. It's about different kinds of similar things. So for example, what Carol is referring to is a garment may not have both flax and cotton in the same garment. Why? Who knows? But flax and wool, sorry. Wool being an animal product and flax being an organic product. And there are places in the Orthodox world today where people still are mindful of this, and they take coats and various other things that might have this mix. It's called shatnez, which is and it has a word with no translation other than shatnez, and still observe that, although it's not common practice anymore to make garments of that sort, so it doesn't seem like an issue. But for the other two, the part about mixing seeds, Benita, you had a hand up, I forgot.
I was going to say the same thing about sharpness, but I had an additional question about the parapet on the roof. What would happen if there were an injury? Would the homeowner be in any way liable, assuming that he had not constructed something in the manner defined?
It does seem that way. It says, so that you do not bring blood guilt on your house. Blood guilt is when you are guilty for the blood that was spilt because you failed to do the right thing in terms of when you built. You didn't put your parapet.
Would they be appropriate for a city of refuge, that kind of thing?
Great question. I would imagine so, because it wouldn't be like you intentionally killed the person who fell off the roof and died. I would imagine it would be in the category of manslaughter, but it would have been manslaughter brought about by neglect of a mitzvah that is very clear. So maybe it wouldn't qualify for a city of refuge. I don't know. It might be considered to be your actual responsibility, because we know people fall off roofs, and if you fail to protect people, then you are guilty. But I'm unfortunately not called upon to be a judge. It's a tough decision. Raya, would you like to weigh in what you would decide in that instance?
Well, a parapet would have to be all the way around the house, the whole house.
Yeah, well, all the way around the roof. Yeah.
All the way around the roof.
So what would you say is a person guilty of manslaughter, or what category would be if you neglect to fulfill the safety requirements prescribed by law and then someone gets killed as a result? Like maybe a situation where you hear about people at a party who were on a porch, and too many people went on the porch and the porch collapsed and people died. But if the porch had been built with the proper pillars underneath and supports, that wouldn't have happened, and the building department finds that they haven't secured the...
And they knew about it.
And they knew about it, right. So...
I suppose then they might be liable. But they certainly would be civilly liable anyway.
Civilly, as in other words, needing to pay damages.
Damages, yes.
Well, good to have you here for expert judgments as we deal with many laws that we don't think about putting roofs, parapets around our roofs in this climate anyway. Thank you. So let's go on to chapter 23, the asylum for escaped slaves. You shall not turn over to his master a slave who seeks refuge with you from his master. He shall live with you in any place he may choose among the settlements in your midst, wherever he pleases. You must not ill-treat him. So what do you think of that?
What on? What section?
I'm sorry, this is chapter 23, verse 16, the bottom of the first page. Well, maybe not the bottom of your page, because depends what font you used. Chapter 23, verse 16. Carol, you need to...
Yeah, there's kind of an assumption that the slave has more rights than the owner, that you can collude you can provide shelter to somebody without necessarily knowing that he's been mistreated. I mean, it sort of reminds me of the Underground Railroad, but where we knew that people were treated badly.
Well, we hear...
There's not enough information there to know where the morality is in it, to me.
Well, when it says who seeks refuge with you from his master, it doesn't make it... I'm going with that because it says from his master, that his master had mistreated him. But you're right, it doesn't say that specifically. But on the other hand, when you think about the ways in which a person is diminished through slavery, and if they manage to escape, you have to have more compassion on them than on the slave owner. So
well, that's absolutely true, but you don't know which of those circumstances it is. That it just seems to me that it's kind of undermining the whole notion of ownership. Not that we love that, but just putting yourself back in the time. Yes. It could be that refuge suggests that he was ill-treated, but it also could be that he didn't like it.
Well, I would imagine most slaves don't really like it. And I'm going to, Janet is eager to add something. Unmute first, please. And then Peter. You're still muted.
I just want to say in the Hebrew, it says, Eved Asher Adonav, Eved El Adonav Asher Yinatzel. Now, Yinatzel in Hebrew means exploit. So this explains it. It doesn't explain it in the English. In other words,
Yinatzel, I think, is used in two ways. Lehitnatzel is to save yourself, as in saving.
Oh, Hatzalah.
Hatzalah, to save, and it also means to exploit. And so I think you're right, because it doesn't say lahatzil, it doesn't imply freedom. It does imply some exploitation, but slavery is exploitation.
But I guess this is above and beyond the
yes.
What a master should demand. And that's why you should have pity and compassion and take him in.
Yes, and let him live wherever he wants.
Because it doesn't explain that in the English. So Carol was right in questioning, because then masters would never have control of their slaves. Because if a slave just wants to leave, he just goes off. But if a master...
I want to argue the other side of it is that one of the key themes in our ethical codes in Judaism is Zachor ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt. And it says, don't oppress people because you know the heart of the stranger, for you were slaves in Egypt. It appears multiple times in the Torah. So I would think that the assumption that slavery exists was a given. That was the world they lived in, and it seemed like that would always be the case. But the having compassion on a slave seems to trump the component of ownership. But this is a very wonderful discussion, because in the world of the Torah, and we always have to wear our biblical glasses when we look at these texts and not judge it by 21st century standards. And according to that era, there were rights of slave owners, and slaves shouldn't just run away, especially a slave who might have sold himself into slavery because he couldn't pay a debt. And then he's living with a master who actually isn't mistreating him, who's paid his debt off for him. And then at some point, when the sabbatical year comes, he'll be set free. And so he's wrong in running away, because that was how people paid when they were destitute. They sold themselves into slavery. So if we only look at the rights of a slave, one might say, well, then you'll never have someone who will take in a slave and pay his debts. So it's a really great conversation between looking at it in its context and the compassion for slaves. So thank you both. Peter had his hand up, and then Benita.
Well, my initial thought was that if you would, a slave in some respects is treated as property, though there it was treated as a human being. I'm thinking in the United States, when they had the Civil War, they had the Fugitive Slave Act, which required people in the North to return a slave to the South, which caused an awful lot of problems. But I gather back then, slave was really not property in the sense that we call property. And it's not like a book or a cow or something like that. It was, but you had some obligations to your master. I mean, you just took somebody, it's very troublesome.
It's very complicated stuff to weigh out the rights of, for us anyway, to try to fathom, because in the modern world, slavery is only a bad thing. It never has a brighter side to it. Whereas in the biblical times, we can't really judge it with quite the same standards, because we do know that there were slaves who, when their 7 years were up, would say, I want to stay with my master. And you would have to.
But getting back to Carol's view, that it seemed to be some litigation as to whether the slave was abused by the master or just decided to take off. I don't know who.
And that would probably be a piece that needs to be investigated. Good point. Thank you. Benita, your hand was up, and then we'll go back to
two aspects. Number one, I'm curious how that would have been adjudicated. If you had a situation like that, how would that be decided? And the second piece, which is very troubling to me, is the notion, if you think about what happened in the United States with slavery in the South, there were arguments made that there were slave owners who were very beneficent to their slaves and all of that. That was a subtext that existed and continued well into more contemporary times. That you were not abusing this whole strata of society. You were in fact beneficent to them. You were maintaining them. They weren't able to live on their own and all that kind of stuff. And that there's a residual of that today.
Right, but I think that if you read literature, especially now during this time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, the idea that you were beneficent to someone that you bought on a market.
No question, but I only say it because
it is true. And you're linking into what the Torah says about a slave who wishes to stay with his master because the master is good to him. What is the situation there? And the Torah itself says, not in this part, but somewhere else, that you have to take their ear and pierce it at the front door. At the front door. In other words, in a public place where people can see. This can't just be a backroom deal. It has to be public. That this person says, I want to stay with you forever. And it's frowned on by the Torah because they say, why pierce the ear? Because it's the ear that you heard God say, you need to be free, because a slave doesn't have freedom of will. He has to do what his master tells him. So it's giving up free will, and it's very complicated, but clearly the beneficence you are describing was something that was a known in that ancient world as well. Janet, go ahead.
But it's known in the Torah, it's written that on Shabbat, while you rest, you must give your slave, avadecha ve'amatcha, you must also give them rest, because you yourself was once a slave in Egypt, and you should remember that. And that's constantly, that's like a leitmotif that goes throughout all of Torah.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that in. It's even in the Ten Commandments, where it tells you, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadasho, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and don't do any work, not you or your family or your slaves, male and female, or even your animals. Everybody gets a day off. So the idea of recognizing the need to rest, not necessarily superior for humans than for animals. Even it's more of an animal's right kind of thing, but every living creature needs a day off, is a very powerful concept that we find in the Torah. Betty.
Yeah, but I seem to remember something about you got to milk a cow even on Shabbat.
Absolutely, because that's tsar balei chai, the suffering of a living creature. Milking a cow is similar to other emergency things that have to happen on Shabbat because of suffering. Suffering is not a recommended thing, and if you raise a cow to be a milk-giving cow, you cannot not milk her on Shabbat. And I say that with memories of when I left South Africa and went to kibbutz with my youth group for a year. I, by choice, worked in the dairy with cows, and I had to do it on Shabbat too. And it was a kibbutz that had cows. Cows have to be milked, even though it was a religious kibbutz and nobody else worked. The people who fed the chickens and fed the cows and milked the cows, that was, you don't get a day off from that, but that's not considered to be work in the same way.
But now,
1 second, Peter's got his hand up, and then Janet.
Well, isn't there a restriction on what you can do with the milk that you milk the cow from, both then and if you do it on Yom Kippur? You can't use it. I guess you can give it away to someone but you can't sell it or anything like that. So that
yes,
extraordinary restrictions on what you do.
Right, you can't profit from it. But then there's also a question, which is one called, just trying to think of the name of it in Hebrew, Hefsed Merubeh, great loss. For example, the idea that you have to get rid of all your chametz, that raises a question of great financial loss for people. So the Torah figured out, or the rabbis figured out that workaround. Well, you sell your chametz, so temporarily you don't own it, but then it reverts back to you. Because people don't want to undertake great financial loss in order to keep a mitzvah. And so I'm not sure how that would play itself out here, because also there's another mitzvah about not wasting precious resources, not being wasteful with food. So every problem raises a whole bunch of new possible solutions and more problems.
What did you do in the kibbutz?
I don't remember what the answer is to that. I'm sure that I knew at the time, but I don't want to say because I don't remember.
I just want to add that I think in Israel today, they have electronically established where a human being doesn't have to do it. It's done automatically, especially on Shabbat. Or
it's done automatically from the perspective that it's on a time switch.
Yes, yes.
It would seem that don't use electricity, but there is still the human element of, first of all, bringing the cow into the dairy, and then you have to place the 4 milking cups to the udders of the cow manually. That does not pop up. Maybe now it does, but you have to, it's a very precise job.
Yes.
And maybe I haven't looked into it honestly for the last 40 odd years. I do remember though that it was on a time switch and you had to be on time because the thing was working. And the milking device was operated automatically, but maybe today the cow can be, if they can do surgery remotely with technology, I suppose they could solve that problem as
I
well.
think I read that.
You're right. I have not looked into it, so you're more right than I. Ruth?
Yes, I wanted to say that recently I heard a wonderful lecture on Deuteronomy, and he spoke about, the professor spoke about the first 4 books as being God in power. God liberated us. God was powerful. But in the 5th book, Deuteronomy, that we're studying today, that the power from God has been given to humanity, so that we now have the responsibility. So in what you're speaking about of feeding the cows on Shabbat, where the slaves, or if the slaves are the people that are doing it, they have the responsibility to do it so that cows will be healthy. And
I love the distinction that you made about the laws in Deuteronomy given at this point when the Israelites were about to become free people in their own land, be their own masters of a society. The idea that these are laws for them to now be in charge. That's a great piece of it. And it takes individual responsibility. It's not just God running the show. And we actually see the trouble God has, because the Israelites didn't choose to stick to all the rules, because being human, we generally don't do that. I think we have time for one more little section. I also said that I would tell you what's not good, but I'll save that for the end. I'm sure you, if you wanted to find out more detail on it, it's there in the book to find out. I'm looking now at chapter 23, below those 3 little dots, verse 25, where it says, "When you enter another man's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you are full, but you must not put any in your vessel. When you enter another man's field of standing grain, you may pluck ears with your hand, but you must not put a sickle to your neighbor's grain." That's an amazing idea, right? The commentary that I read in the JPS commentary on this verse says that in ancient times, many roads ran through people's fields. And we also saw in the book of Numbers, when the Israelites wanted to cross through territory of other tribes, they said, "We won't stray to the right or the left or eat from your fields or drink from your wells," because in the ancient world, there wasn't just, Route 128 and other big roads where you just keep going, which even those roads were built often by taking property away from private owners. But in any case, in those days, pathways, roadways ran crisscross through people's fields. So there had to be rules about what to do. If you went through someone's field, you were allowed to eat, but you weren't allowed to take it home with you. If you were hungry, it was a kind of hospitality. Have what you need, but don't overdo it. And don't come and take from their field. And it says he quotes Josephus in saying that in ancient times, it was a kind of hospitality seen appropriate to give strangers, but other writers in the Talmud actually say this had to be modified, otherwise it would run the field owner out of business, because if he lived on a main road and lots of people came by and everybody had a right to a free meal, what would happen to his income? And so they limited it in certain circumstances to being just the workers in that field. Strangers who went by could not do it, but people who worked in the field and were in there all the time could eat what they needed, but not take home for others. Alan, go ahead.
It's interesting, is a parallel today in the community gardens. We're finding that ripe vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, and so forth, which are there and just about ready to be picked, and you come by the next day to your garden and someone else has come by and taken that for their own use. So it's interesting that this is something else. Nobody has yet said, well, checking the Bible, it says, or checking the Talmud, it says it's all right to do.
Well, it's not necessarily the same. I see Benita's hand ready to go. Are you responding to that, Benita?
Oh, I absolutely am. Alan, there is photographic documentation who the culprits are, and they don't have 2 legs, they have 4 legs. We have seen the squirrels nibbling away at the tomatoes. We have seen the woodchuck in there. And there has been photo examination of the security cameras. It's not 2-legged people. So we are
good to see.
For sure. So I just want to put that to rest.
Thank you. And I think that that's it's very upsetting when you plant something and you come back there and somebody's helped themselves. I think they weren't talking about pleasure gardens as these are, but rather fields that provided sustenance, and also in a community where many people were very poor and walking through there, maybe traveling for days from one place to another. They didn't have refrigeration. They were hungry. They needed to have a little nush along the way. So different than our situation, but nonetheless the same emotion. The owner who raises the crop wants to be able to enjoy it themselves and not find it has disappeared. Peter?
This harkens back to Abraham, that when people come by, you have to give them hospitality, but they don't give them a doggy bag to take it home with them.
That's right. You eat what you can eat there and you don't take it home. Right. Newbridge has rules like that too in the days of the buffet, right?
Oh, yes.
You can eat, but you can't take it home. So we are, is there time for one more? Let's just squeeze in one more. We may not be able to add too many comments on it. It's chapter 24, verse 10. When you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you must not enter his house to seize his pledge. You must remain outside while the man to whom you made the loan brings the pledge out to you. If he is a needy man, you shall not go to sleep in his pledge. You must return the pledge to him at sundown, that he may sleep in his cloth and bless you, and it will be to your merit before the Lord your God. So this is an interesting concept in terms of seizing property, that if a person takes a loan and offers as security a particular item, and then they default on their loan or their rent and they don't pay, and the owner or the lender has a legal claim, you can go as far as to the person's house, but you cannot barge in and violate the little bit of privacy that they have in their home and show that you are the master inside their home. The sensitivity to a person who is defaulting on a loan is quite impressive, in my opinion. The idea of emphasizing, it says you may not enter his house to seize his pledge, you must remain outside while the person brings you the pledge. You are trying not to destroy the respect of this individual. The person has a right to some dignity. Yes, he can't pay his loan, but that doesn't mean you have a right to invade his home and take his stuff. So that's one piece of it. And then in the word in verse 12, if he is needy, the commentary on that is destitute. If a person is really down and out and the only possession they could offer as a pledge was their blanket, and then they don't pay you, and you come and you take the blanket as an incentive for them to pay you, or as a way of selling the blanket to recoup your loss, the Torah says, no, you can't do that. This guy needs his blanket. Don't take someone's last piece of property. You can take it during the day, but remember, he's a human being. He needs a blanket at night. You need to return it. And the humanity in these verses seems to echo a common theme of remembering human dignity, remembering animal dignity, and also thinking about resources of the planet. And I'll take one more comment. Anyone have a thought on this? No. Okay. So the next one goes on about, it emphasizes it even more. Many of these laws are pretty short, but if you look at verse 14, you shall not abuse a needy and destitute laborer, whether a fellow countryman or a stranger in one of the communities of your land. You must pay him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is needy and urgently depends on it. Else he will cry to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe these commandments. So again, it's one more example of a day laborer. It's hard to think about it when people get paid automatically by salaries that go into bank accounts nowadays, but there still are people, particularly immigrant, migrant workers who work in fields, and they are day laborers. They have no benefits, no security, and they need their money at the end of the day. And the reminder after this whole section of commandments is to remember that once you were vulnerable, and may be good for you right now, but you need to have empathy and identify with the suffering of other people. I wanted to, was that your hand, Alan? No. I wanted to just fulfill what I said earlier about there are many objectionable things, and I made a selection. I don't want to sugarcoat this and make it seem like there are only beautiful, thoughtful, sensitive laws in this Torah portion, because you could open it up and find out that in fact there are others that feel troubling to us today. Most of them relate to women's rights, things such as taking female prisoners of war that you capture, and then on the other hand, there's a nice part, you can't just rape them, you have to marry them, and if you decide afterwards you don't like them, you have to give them a divorce settlement. So sounds good, but the premise of it, that you can actually take women by force, is troubling to us. There's also a whole section on false accusations of a bride not being a virgin, which was considered to be a breach of contract, because when a father married off his daughter and said she's a virgin and it turns out she's not, that's a different bride price. And so there's a whole section on proving or disproving this very delicate matter, and the punishment for a man who does falsely accuse, and the punishment for a guilty bride. The bride does not fare well in this, let me assure you. There's also a section on adultery with a married woman, an unacceptable option in the Torah, and then adultery with an engaged virgin. And in other words, she's engaged to someone else, she is a virgin, and then you commit adultery with her, which is assumed to be consensual perhaps, but because she was already betrothed, there are very serious consequences around that as well. And there are many more. I won't belabor it because it's 12 o'clock, but I will. Oh, Raya, yes.
Now, it's interesting that the bride is the one who is punished, not the father who made the contract.
Because she is considered to be having shamed her father, because her father didn't know this and he made a bad business deal, because after all, marriage was a financial arrangement between father and groom, and she put him to shame, and we don't like that.
And if he knew? If the father knew,
then he would have had to make appropriate arrangements for his non-virgin daughter by letting the prospective groom know what the circumstances are, and that would be very difficult. He wouldn't be able to make a good shidduch under those conditions. So there's many aspects here that make me feel I'm glad I was born in the 20th century than in these times, but there are other many compassionate rules. So thank you all for being here on screen with me and participating. And thank you to everybody at home for being involved, for watching, and I hope that you found this conversation enjoyable and satisfying. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.